They thought if they could whisper enough poison, if they could twist just enough minds that they could cancel the favor on your life. They believed if they sowed enough doubt, if they flipped the hearts of those closest to you, then your strength would shrivel, your purpose would crack, and your spirit would collapse under the weight of rejection. But what they didn't know, and what they could never grasp, is that purpose isn't built on popularity. Destiny isn't determined by the crowd. And what God has set in motion, no lie can derail. They watched you walk with favor and mistook it for weakness. They saw your calm spirit and misread it as naivety. They saw your kindness and believed they could weaponize it against you. So they turned people, not just strangers, but ones you loved, ones you trusted, ones you would have bled for. And they thought the silence that followed would be your undoing. But silence doesn't break a person of vision. Isolation doesn't crush someone who's rooted in truth. No, it reveals something far more powerful. It reveals how empty the opposition is when God is no longer with them. When they launched their plan, they never considered the cost. They didn't calculate that in trying to destroy your name, they'd exposed their own intentions. They didn't realize that the very people they tried to turn would begin to see through the performance. Because when your life is consistent, when your fruit speaks louder than their gossip, truth begins to echo in places they thought were theirs to control. And one by one, the hearts they corrupted started waking up. Not for your sake, but because truth has a way of surviving. Lies demand constant attention. Truth doesn't. They underestimated how pain fuels purpose. They thought betrayal would cause you to shrink, but it caused you to evolve. It stretched your character. It refined your discernment. It cut away dead weight and opened space for divine alignment. They thought they exiled you, but in reality, they escorted you into your next dimension. They thought they shamed you, but they actually set the stage for your elevation. And as your influence grew, they had to watch from the shadows they created. That's the price of manipulation. Eventually, the manipulators are left with nothing but the sound of their own schemes echoing back at them. You see, when your foundation is truth, when your calling is from God, you can't be unmade by slander. You can't be undone by betrayal. You don't break when others fall away and you multiply. You increase. You ascend. Because your source was never the crowd. It was always the calling. It was never their approval that sustained you. It was divine assignment. They can smear your name, but they cannot touch your identity. They can shift perceptions, but they cannot shift purpose. And now, those who laughed when you wept are restless while you rise. The very ones who stood proud while you were torn down, now watch it in confusion as you stand taller than ever. Because favor doesn't leave with the crowd. Glory doesn't disappear in rejection. When you are chosen, even in your lowest moment, heaven still recognizes you. And when God prepares a table in the presence of your enemies, it's not to shame you. It's to remind them who you are without saying a word. They plotted, they schemed, they unified in wickedness, thinking it would end you. But unity and evil always births self-destruction. In trying to break you, they exposed their own cracks. In trying to curse you, they stepped outside of grace. And now the very weapon they sharpened for your downfall has turned on them. Because God does not abandon the righteous. He does not forget those who suffer in silence for his name's sake. What was meant to bury you became the very soil that nourished the seed of your legacy. Let them talk. Let them gather. Let them plot. Because every scheme they build without truth as its foundation will collapse. Every lie they tell will come back void. And every person they turned will witness the unraveling of deception and the restoration of truth. Not because you fought back, but because you stood firm. Because you knew the moment. You stopped defending yourself as the moment heaven begins to defend you. When they plot, God prepares. Thought destroying your image would destroy your future. But they never understood. Your future was never built on what they saw. It was built on what God spoke. And what he spoke is still unfolding. You're still standing, still rising, still marked. And they are watching, learning, and falling. Not because of what you did to them, but because of what they did trying to stop you. They made the fatal mistake of thinking your destiny was up for debate. as if the whispers of people could overwrite the word of God. They assumed that if enough people turned their backs on you, then heaven would too. They believed that your value was determined by how many applauded, how many agreed, how many followed. But what they didn't realize is that divine purpose is insulated from public opinion. It's not voted into existence. It doesn't need validation. It was written before they had an opinion, and it will stand long after they change it. What was authored in eternity cannot be cancelled by the temporary moods of men. They saw you losing numbers and thought you were losing relevance. They saw you walking alone and thought you were walking away from your calling. But God doesn't measure purpose by the size of your circle. He measures it by the strength of your assignment. Favor is not popularity. Purpose is not applause. It's obedience that secures destiny, not attention. And when you're walking in obedience, even in silence, you're more powerful than a crowd walking in confusion. When they turned hearts against you, they expected your vision to die. They expected your voice to weaken. But what they didn't see was that your source wasn't external. You weren't drawing strength from people's approval. You were drawing it from something deeper, something unshakable. You were sustained by conviction, by clarity, by covenant. And covenant doesn't break when the crowd breaks. Covenant holds when everything else falls away. What you carry is not dependent on their claps or their company. You could be rejected by all and still rise because you were never sent to be liked. You were sent to be light. They misjudged your silence as defeat, not knowing it was consecration. They saw your quiet as collapse, not knowing it was alignment. Because when God separates you from the crowd, it's not punishment, it's preparation. He doesn't need everyone to agree with you in order to use you. He doesn't need public consensus to release private anointing. In fact, sometimes he'll allow the crowd to scatter so the vision becomes sharper. The voice becomes purer and the mission becomes unstoppable. Their strategy was human, yours is divine. They needed noise to stay relevant. You needed stillness to stay aligned. They built alliances. You built an altar. And while they were busy managing people's opinions, you were being molded in the presence of the one who matters. What they called exile was actually an encounter. What they called rejection was divine redirection. And what they thought would break you actually revealed that you're built on something they can't touch. Your purpose cannot be revoked, rerouted, or rewritten by fragile hands. Their rejection of you never threatened God's acceptance of you. Their shift in loyalty didn't cause a shift in destiny. The oil on your life was poured before they met you. The calling on your soul was sealed before they knew your name. And now that they've walked away, you're discovering what was there all along. Unshaken identity, unmovable assignment, and undeniable grace. They thought the people were your platform. They thought the crowd gave you power, but now they see it was never them. It was always him. They thought betrayal would break you, that it would leave you crawling through ruins, questioning your worth, doubting your vision, and begging for clarity. But betrayal did something far more dangerous to their plan. It awakened something in you. They expected you to fall apart, not level up. They thought the knife in your back would paralyze you, not sharpen your discernment. They believed that removing themselves from your life would reduce your value. But instead, it removed the veil from your eyes. You stopped entertaining illusion. You stopped negotiating your worth. You stopped waiting for loyalty from the disloyal. And that shift rewrote everything. The very betrayal that was designed to bury you became a mirror that revealed who you really are and what you truly carry. It stripped away the noise and forced you into deeper clarity. It brought you face to face with your essence. Not the version they applauded, but the version God always intended. When the mask of loyalty fell off their face, something in your soul stood up straighter. You saw the snakes and stopped dancing in their gardens. You saw the false smiles and stopped pouring into empty wells. Betrayal didn't make you bitter. It made you sharper, wiser, stronger, quieter, louder where it matters, silent where it saves. They thought walking away would reduce your fire. Instead, it fed the flames because real elevation often begins in the pit of abandonment. Real growth often requires separation, and some doors only open after people exit. When they left, they didn't realize they cleared the space for transformation. They left thinking it would leave you desperate. But you weren't left behind. You were lifted. What they meant as rejection became your realignment. What they intended as punishment became the pruning God used to prepare you for more. That betrayal forced you to tap into a strength you didn't know was there. You began to rebuild, not from a place of pride, but from the raw sacred awareness that you can thrive without the ones you once thought were essential. You started operating from revelation, not reaction. You stopped defending your value and started protecting your peace. And in that silence, heaven began speaking louder. Your pain turned into prophecy. Your losses turned into lessons. Your wounds became wells of wisdom. And every scar now speaks not of defeat, but of survival, of sacred separation, of destiny untangled from deception. What they meant to destroy you became divine construction. Their betrayal laid the foundation for a version of you they could never control. It made you see who was real, who was useful, and who was sent to delay your calling. They taught you not through love, but through loss. And you learned that betrayal doesn't come to end the story. It comes to expose the plot. It doesn't always mean you're in the wrong place. Sometimes it means you're just too right for the wrong people. Sometimes the ones who walk away are God's loudest answer to your silent prayers. They thought you would beg for their return. They thought you would crumble trying to prove your worth to the ones who never valued it in the first place, but instead you rose. Not with vengeance, not with rage, but with vision. Clear, bold, heaven-aligned vision. Because betrayal no longer defines you. It refined you. It didn't stop your story. It unlocked the chapter they were never worthy to read. And now, while they whisper about your downfall, you're living proof that what was meant to break you has only built something they can't undo. Lies are needy. They are fragile, attention-hungry distortions that constantly require upkeep to survive. They need to be repeated, rehearsed, and reinforced because they have no roots in reality. And that's what they depended on. That if they could repeat the same lie enough times, if they could flood the room with enough suspicion, if they could turn the volume of gossip high enough, truth would drown in the noise. But truth doesn't panic. It doesn't chase crowds or defend itself in desperation. Truth walks with dignity. It doesn't shout. It simply waits. Because while lies rush to be believed, truth is patient enough to be revealed. They launched their accusations like arrows, hoping that how rejection becomes redirection, confusion would do the rest. They didn't even need evidence. They counted on emotion, on groupthink, on herd mentality. They relied on people not asking questions, just swallowing the story. But every lie carries a ticking clock. Every false narrative requires maintenance. They had to keep repeating it, keep exaggerating, keep adding new details just to keep it alive. Because lies don't live on fact. They live on drama, and drama always burns itself out. They created smoke, but there was no fire. And eventually, people began to notice. The story kept changing. The tone became desperate. The energy turned toxic. And slowly, eyes began to open. What they didn't account for was your consistency. They underestimated the power of your fruit, your character, your record, your discipline, your silence. Because even in the face of falsehood, you didn't fight dirty. You didn't lower your voice to their level. You didn't scramble to explain what you never did. You stayed rooted. And roots don't panic when storms blow through. They dig deeper. The truth you carried began to speak through your actions, through your endurance, through your peace. And the contrast between your presence and their performance became undeniable. They thought controlling the story meant controlling the outcome. But no matter how loud a lie is, it cannot outlive the truth. Truth has a strange way of showing up when you least expect it. Not with fanfare, but with clarity. One by one, the pieces began to fall into place. The inconsistencies exposed themselves. The contradictions grew louder than the lies. And suddenly the ones who believed so quickly began to question so quietly. Not because you proved anything, but because the truth doesn't need defense when the lie starts to decay on its own. They assumed the battle was external, but it was always spiritual. Lies operate in shadows. Truth stands in the light. And when you belong to the light, You don't chase rumors, you outlast them. You don't explain yourself to darkness. You shine until it fades. And that's what happened. While they were exhausting themselves trying to keep the story alive, you kept moving, kept building, kept growing. You lived in a way that made the lies impossible to believe. And that's the beauty of truth. It's not performative. It just is. In the end, the weight of maintaining the lie became too much for them. The cracks widened, the energy shifted, the illusion collapsed, and those who once fed on the drama now sit in silence, watching what they once questioned flourish without their approval. Because the truth has a pulse. It lives. And no matter how buried, it finds its way to the surface always. What they tried to bury you with became the very thing that vindicated you. They poured lies like concrete, but didn't know you were the seed. And truth, even under pressure, grows quietly, unapologetically, irrefutably. When LHE noise died down and the crowds faded, something sacred happened. You started to hear more clearly. Not the voices of critics or the opinions of spectators, but the steady, unwavering voice of destiny calling you deeper. When no one was clapping, you found out what you truly believed about yourself. When no one was watching, you discovered whether your actions were rooted in obedience or performance. Isolation stripped the stage and left only the raw, the real, and the unshakable. And, in that place, you weren't being punished. You were being purified. You were being recalibrated, not broken, but built. They thought your worth would shrink when the room got quiet, but the quiet became your teacher. You found strength that applause had distracted you from. You found identity that affirmation had masked. You started walking in alignment that crowds had once confused. In solitude, your authenticity emerged. Your discernment sharpened. Your prayers deepened. The mask slipped off, not because it was ripped away, but because it was no longer needed. You were no longer living for connection at the cost of your calling. You were no longer addicted to access or busy trying to keep people who were only sent to delay you. You learned that the ones who walked away were never your covering. They were your crowd, and sometimes God has to remove the crowd to release the calling. The silence didn't strip you. It revealed you. It didn't erase your voice. It amplified your clarity. They saw you alone and assumed you were abandoned. But God doesn't leave His own in the wilderness to be forgotten. He leaves them there to be refined. What they called your downfall was your divine encounter. While they laughed from a distance, you were receiving downloads that would birth your next dimension. You were being prepared for rooms their names won't be mentioned in. You were growing in shadows they didn't even know existed. And when you re-emerged, they didn't recognize you because you weren't a recycled version of who you were. You were renewed, rooted, radiating with something no lie, no betrayal, and no absence could take away. They assumed that your strength came from the people. But what you carry was never theirs to give and never theirs to take. It wasn't born in applause. It was born in obedience. It was forged in nights of silence, in seasons of invisibility, in moments where you had to choose whether to believe the promise or believe the pain. And you chose well. You chose faith when doubt seemed easier. You chose patience when you could have rushed. You chose stillness when you could have screamed. And because of that, your foundation became unbreakable. Not built on validation, but on vision. Not on approval, but on alignment. So now when they look at you, rising in silence, building in peace, glowing without needing to be seen, they can't understand how you made it. They forgot that isolation doesn't destroy the cold. It defines them. They forgot that being alone with God is more powerful than being surrounded by people without purpose. And now they watch, confused and uncomfortable because the very thing they thought would end you became the very place you discovered the version of yourself they could never compete with. They planned to bury you. The silence that speaks louder than words. That was their strategy. Smother your name in silence, cover your path with shame, surround your identity with falsehoods, and press the weight of their betrayal down until you disappeared under it all. But they didn't realize that you weren't being buried. You were being planted. There's a difference. Burial is meant to end something. Planting is the beginning of transformation. They confused one for the other, never realizing